All right, welcome back for session 5, Equitable Student Support. Let's go ahead and dive into this one, guys. So first we'll review our session objectives just like every other session. Then we will spend the first part talking about and reflecting on implicit bias and our own implicit biases. This is really important because it'll set us up for the other components of this session and how we can provide great support in an equitable way for all of our students. We'll continue on by reviewing daily feedback and talking about the escalation process, and then you will spend time digging into some different classroom scenarios and thinking about how you would respond to them, and you'll complete your session reflection form. I want to note that talking about implicit bias can be challenging and difficult. I really want to encourage you as you are doing these reflections and we dive into that you be vulnerable and take time to really reflect meaningfully. It's very important for our students. So our objectives for this session is that you'll be able to understand what implicit bias is, begin uncovering your own implicit biases, and identify ways you can mitigate your own implicit bias in the classroom. Then you'll learn how to process and address daily feedback from students. You'll be able to describe the process for requesting additional support from Girls Who Code, and you'll be able to practice de-escalating procedures for classroom scenarios. So this is a really important session, and I really encourage you to take the full time for it or to potentially take extra time to make sure that you feel good about all of these aspects of student support. So far we've covered a lot of different techniques that you can use to create a positive classroom culture, including teaching moves and instructional techniques. As I said, in this session, we're going to be digging deep into implicit bias and talking about processes, systems, and techniques that you can use to provide equitable support to students in your campus classroom. So, diving into implicit bias. What is implicit bias? Implicit bias is the bias in judgment and/or behavior that results from subtle cognitive processes, for example, attitudes and stereotypes, that often operate at a level below conscious awareness and without intentional control. Although automatic, implicit biases are not completely inflexible. They're malleable to some degree and manifest in ways that are responsive to the perceiver's motives and environment. I also want to call out that when we talk about implicit bias, you may also hear it described as unconscious bias. I want to name that those terms are interchangeable. Who we are and how we see ourselves can often shape how we see others and the world around us. So we're going to spend time reflecting on ourselves and how it impacts our relationships. As I mentioned, I really encourage you to be honest in your reflections. Obviously, these things are private. You're not doing this in a group, but I would even encourage you to chat about it with someone you feel comfortable with, or reach out to people on the Slack channel to discuss this as well. So let's dive into the first type of bias that we're going to talk about. So affinity bias is the tendency to warm up to people who are like ourselves. What I want you to do to kind of unpack affinity bias is in your workbook there is an area for you to reflect on these questions. If you don't want to do it in your workbook, then I encourage you to open up a Google Doc or somewhere else and reflect on what were you like as a student? What was your working style? What was your behavior like? What aspects of your personality do you admire in others? Everyone is going to answer these questions differently, and here we're trying to understand ourselves because we have a tendency to like other people like ourselves. So take about 5 minutes to reflect before you come back. And go ahead and pause the video. Okay. Keeping this in mind, we're going to talk about another type of bias, the halo bias. Halo bias is the tendency to think everything about a person is good because you like that person. What I would like for you to do is we're going to be thinking about the types of students that you might naturally gravitate towards and how this might make you see them in a light where they do no wrong. I know that I can think of examples, both of myself and other teachers, where there are certain students, because we have great relationships with them, we become blinded to the other things that they might do, and it means we might be treating them or treating other students inequitably. So the first question I want you to reflect on is, who are the students you gravitate towards at school or in an after-school club or things like that, and why do you gravitate towards them? And then the second question is, what characteristics do students possess that allow me to quickly feel connected to them? Is it that you share similar interests? Is it that you're both kind of quiet, or you're both kind of jokey? Like, think about as many characteristics as possible. Go ahead and pause the video for about 5 minutes or longer if you need it to reflect on these questions as well. Okay. The next type of bias that we're going to talk about is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency for people to seek information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. What I would like for you to do is you're going to, again, pause the video and reflect on these questions. The first question is, are there students who I expect will be challenging when I lead a lesson? If so, what experiences led me to believe this? If so, how, if at all, does this impact my interactions with these students? I think a lot of us that have taught, I know myself, I can think of students who maybe really had struggles in the classroom on different days, or had a lot of different things going on, and it can be so easy to assume that and get in a negative headspace that student is going to like come in and like they're going to behave in a way that feels disruptive to our classrooms. But we need to challenge ourselves there about what pre-existing beliefs or assumptions we're making and how we're projecting that onto students, and how that might actually lead for some of those things to become or to manifest themselves. So I encourage you to really be honest in these questions and in this part of the reflection, and then to tie it back to thinking about our approach at Girls Who Code, where we create a restorative environment where each day is fresh, and like how that might be something that we need to think about in this scenario. So go ahead and pause the video for about 5 or more minutes if you need it, and reflect on these questions in your workbook. All right, thank you for doing that and for your deep reflection. We have one more area that we're going to reflect on and start kind of making action plans about how we can address these different types of implicit bias that we've just been talking about. So it's not enough for us to just uncover implicit biases. We have to figure out what we're actually going to do about them. For the next few minutes, I want you to think about what it will look like, sound like, and feel like to build and sustain your relationships with students. One of the ways that we can combat some of these or mitigate these implicit biases that we all have and that manifest themselves in different ways is to really focus on building relationships with students and getting to know them as individuals. Because when we know people as individuals and we get to know our students, these biases begin to fade away, or we are able to kind of look past them and see that person and empathize with them more. So some things that you might be thinking about, and to kind of get your creative juices flowing here, are you might decide to come to class, or when you are starting out the day or at lunch or at breaks, intentionally chat with different students at lunch or at breaks to get to know them on a deeper level. Don't just chat with the same students or the ones that you already have relationships with, but make a point to get to know students that maybe you don't naturally gravitate towards. You might also, before reacting to something that happens in the classroom, pause and think about these implicit biases that you've just reflected on and how they might be influencing your reaction or perception of that situation. Just that pause and reflection can give you enough time to decide to take a different action and respond in a much more equitable and empathetic way. Another thing you might think about doing is asking questions and seeking understanding in a situation. So rather than making judgments or assigning blame or assigning intent behind certain actions, asking students, what's going on, how they're feeling, what's their perception of the situation, so that way you can address maybe the biases you're already kind of coming with that, where you're reinforcing preconceived notions of students. So again, in your workbook, go ahead and reflect on what it will look like, sound like, and feel like to build and sustain your relationships with students to mitigate your bias. Go ahead and pause the video. All right, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to reflect and to think about these things. It can feel uncomfortable, but hopefully, especially with this last reflection, thinking about very specific actions that you can do to address them, feels empowering and feels like you have some new tools to help you create a more inclusive and equitable class. In the next parts of the session, we're going to be discussing escalation and incident management. And it's super important for us to consider these implicit biases that we just reflected on and the strategies that we've just discussed for mitigating our biases as we de-escalate incidents, provide support to our students, and then request help from Girls Who Code Central. So keep these reflections at top of mind as we continue with the rest of the session. So first we'll talk about daily feedback, because this is the first way that you can request support and raise things that might be happening in the room. So each day of campus, you and students will complete a daily feedback survey, and this is found on HQ. Students complete it during the daily wrap-up, and yours is shared in the instructor toolkit. You'll complete yours after reviewing student feedback really this should be before 5 p.m., like before you sign off for the day. In order to complete your feedback, you're actually going to review what students see, and you'll see like in the instructions that you're able to view your classroom's specific feedback that day to inform your own reflection. So what I'd like for you to do is you're going to pause the video again and take a few minutes and read through the student and teacher feedback forms, and then think about these questions below as you read. What types of questions are students asked, and how might this data help you teach campus and be more responsive in the classroom? What types of questions do we ask you to reflect on? And what should you be considering and looking for throughout the day in order to reflect at the end of the day? How do these daily reflections relate to the larger goals of campus, and then what questions do you have? So pause the video and then go ahead and come back and we'll continue on. Okay. Before we move on to the escalation process, I wanted to just highlight a few important things about the daily feedback that I hope that you notice. So the first thing is that daily feedback is how you can quote-unquote press the red button, saying that you need help from Girls Who Code. This might be for things like computer or Wi-Fi issues that you might be noticing that there's some clickiness happening, a student arrives late, a student withdraws from the program. These are just a few examples of things that you can use. You can also use daily feedback to share curriculum feedback. So if you notice something was off that day, or maybe you really liked something that day, you can share that with us, and we read all of it and use it to inform the changes that we make each year. We really appreciate it. And just a few reminders so that you can be a super user of daily feedback. Students should complete this by 4 p.m. You should complete it by 5 p.m. And you should have reviewed student daily feedback by 4:30 p.m. And then Girls Who Code, generally myself or Jasmine, it might also be other team members, We'll respond to any red button issues by that evening. It doesn't mean we will have always resolved them by then, but we will get back to you with a plan of action and kind of what next steps will be by that evening. All right, now we're going to dive into the escalation process. Before we jump into what the steps of the escalation process is, I think it's really important to ground ourselves again in our approach to the classroom and our approach to students and our interactions with them. So remember that we foster a restorative environment, and we approach each day as a brand new day for each student. As a strength-based approach, we identify and develop students' natural talents and help them apply that to the process of learning, intellectual development, and academic achievement. This means we establish a warm and caring atmosphere that fosters one-on-one relationships with students. We use multiple learning strategies, reward efforts, recognize progress, and embody love, acceptance, and respect. And we also use a low inference approach. This means that all communication regarding student behavior or actions should avoid ascribing intent or emotion to actions and state only observable actions. This will be very important to think about as we talk about the escalation process and as you are doing your reflection of different scenarios in the classroom. We really want to make sure that it's low inference and we are not ascribing intent or emotion. Okay, so what I would like for you to do is you're going to review the escalation procedure that's linked here. It's also going to be in the teacher toolkit. Take about 5 minutes to read through it, and then if you have time, you can preview the incident report as well. So pause the video for about 5 minutes and review those, and then come back. Great. Now that you've had a chance to review it, I'm going to talk through just a few highlights so that way certain portions are really clear. So in our escalation procedure, the first step is for you to de-escalate the situation calmly and promptly, as quickly as you can. No one makes their best decisions when emotions are high. So consider your surroundings. Should this conversation be held in private, in public? Is it one-on-one? If necessary, relocate yourself to ensure you're not disturbing other students or partner employees and that everyone feels safe to share. Acknowledge your students' emotions and experiences. Even if they're saying something you disagree with or don't have evidence of, make sure that they feel heard. Next, take a breath. So if you're feeling emotional, remember that it's not about you at this point. You should be thinking of what your student just told you and how it affects their experience, as well as everyone else's in your classroom. If they're agitated or excited, be a calming presence. Ask your students what they need. Don't assume what would make them feel better or force them to do something they don't want to do. If they say they want to do something out of the scope of our policies, propose a compromise. Finally, use your best judgment. We know that teaching is hard and full of unexpected challenges, and we hired you because we trust you. The next step is gathering information. And gathering information is the best way to help us at Girls Who Code help you. So keep in mind that not all information is created or collected equally. A long email does not equal information that can be used to solve a problem. To help us better help you, please go directly to the sources or people involved, especially anyone you haven't heard from. Make sure that you write things down when you hear them. An example is on the next slide, but think of it like when you're writing a script or a court log. As you record your observations, focus on facts and things you or your sources saw, and avoid emotions, assigning intent, or using terms that are culturally constructed. So here's an example of a high inference email and its low inference equivalent. You're going to be practicing this shortly in your scenario analysis, but the high inference version, Isabel is being really disruptive. It's impossible to get her to stay on task, and she's super rude to partners and speakers. It's making some students uncomfortable, but it's wearing off on others and making the class really hard to manage for all of us. So that's high inference. That's what we want to avoid. The same email could be rewritten in a low inference way, where it focuses more on the facts. So Monday, while I was introducing a group project, Isabel interrupted me and said, "Why do we even have to learn this?" Eric was sitting next to her and started laughing. He asked the same question before I finished the project introduction. Yesterday, while a VP of the partner company was speaking, both Isabel and Eric were using their phones. I walked over to their table and said, "Please remember our classroom contract says no screens when visitors are here," but they did not respond and continued to use their phones. Once the speaker left, I asked them to come into the hallway and we had the following discussion, and then you might include a script of your discussion. This allows us to focus on the facts and better support you. The next step in the escalation procedure is to speak to your support system. You should reach out to us, the teaching team, campus@girlswhocode.com, complete the daily feedback survey, write a button, or depending on what's happened, you might submit an incident report. We can let you know if you need to do that. Conduct the conversation in private and away from students. So if you're going to chat with your teaching partner or someone else, make sure you do it in a place where they aren't listening. Consider if other members of your teaching team should be involved. Is this something you need to pull your TA or your instructor in for? And then establish clear next steps for your team, students, and any other stakeholders, and set a time to check back in. If you need to express any emotions yourself, now is the appropriate time to do so. The final steps in our procedure include following up first with your girls. Make sure those involved feel supported, welcome in the classroom, and able to participate. While you're doing this, be aware of your tone and body language. Not everything is the end of the world, but keep in mind that your priority all summer is maintaining that safe classroom environment. If that felt shaky for any students, make it clear that it's important to you and reiterate everyone's role in shaping your classroom culture. Your classroom contract is a really great tool for this. Finally, you need to close the loop with any other stakeholders and get ready for the next day. Each girl deserves a new day and you do too. Holding on to any of these conflicts will not make your summer easier. So when communicating with partners, when closing up the loop, consider if you need to talk to students, teachers, families, partners, Girls Who Code Central. And when you are communicating with partners, we really ask that you make sure that any messaging aligns with what we at Girls Who Code Central has shared with you. So before we dive into our scenario analysis, I just want to point out some differences between red button and escalation situations. So some examples of emergencies would be a non-life-threatening accident, a life-threatening emergency, a shelter-in-place or a lockdown, an early dismissal. So in these scenarios, you want to make sure you always account for student and personal safety first. Make sure you and your girls are safe. Follow any school or building-specific safety protocols, and then contact us by phone or email as soon as possible, and you'll submit an incident report. When we talk about escalation and red button issues, some examples might include internet access, a student is sick, student conduct violations, so maybe they're not following the norms in the classroom contract, a student discloses an unsafe behavior or home situation. You want to use the red button tool in the daily feedback. So follow these escalation procedures, submit a red button through daily feedback, and then follow up and complete any of our required documentation. It's possible we may ask for you to also submit an incident report. All right, so the last part of this session that you're going to do before you do your reflection is you're going to pick a classroom scenario to think through, not with a partner, but with yourself, and then you're going to use the note catcher in your workbook and the escalation process to write out a plan for how you would respond. If you finish early, go ahead and pick or if you just want to, go ahead and pick another scenario and repeat the process. This could be a great thing to also discuss in the Slack channel with other people about which scenarios they picked and how they chose to respond, and it's something that I'm happy to discuss in our like office hours or virtual Q&A session in the beginning of June as well. So go ahead and pause and do your scenario analysis, and then once you've completed your scenario analysis, complete your session reflection form. You'll want to copy and paste your scenario analysis into that reflection form as well. And that's the end of this session. Thank you.